There was a name that even the wolves feared to speak aloud. Not the name of a king, not the name of a warrior, and not the name of a beast born with claws longer than memory itself. It was the name of an assassin, a shadow that moved through ancient wolf packs like a sickness, silent and sure, leaving behind nothing but cold bodies and wide, empty eyes. No one had ever seen him coming, and no one had ever lived long enough to say they had seen him leave. Every alpha, every warlord, every mighty wolf who sat upon a stone throne believed they were safe, because they had warriors, because they had walls, because they had the strongest fighters that any pack had ever raised. But walls did not stop a shadow, and warriors could not fight what they could not see, and no stone throne had ever saved the one sitting on it. Oh, the packs whispered that he was not born of any wolf mother, that he had crawled out of the dark between the stars, and that the moon herself had turned away the night he first drew blood. For 3 long generations, this assassin had moved through the ancient lands, and not one pair of eyes had ever caught him in time. Not one. Until the night a small, quiet Omega girl named Tamvela, with no rank, no power, and no reason to be anywhere near the Alpha King's great hall, saw him, read him, and drove a blade through his chest before he could finish what he came to do. No one sent Tamvela, no one trained her for that moment, and no one, not even she, fully understood what had been sleeping inside her all along. They would whisper her name for generations after that night, the Omega who saw what no warrior could see, the Omega who moved when every mighty wolf stood still, the Omega who saved a king and shook the entire ancient world of Wolvenhar to its deepest roots. This is that story, and it will not let you rest easy once you have heard it. Before we go any further, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below, because wolves from every corner of the world are gathering here tonight, and I want to know exactly where you are joining us from. The village of Ashkora sat low between 2 ancient hills, and the trees around it were so old that their roots had broken through the ground like the bones of something long buried and restless. The pack that lived there was not a small pack, but it was not one of the great ones either, and every wolf inside those walls knew exactly where they stood in the order of things. Rank was everything in the old world, and rank was something you felt in your chest before anyone ever said a word to you about it. An alpha walked into a room and the air shifted, and your shoulders pulled down without you meaning them to, and your eyes dropped before your mind caught up with your body. A beta stood tall and sure, and when they gave a command, your legs moved before your thoughts did, because that was simply how things worked in those ancient lands. And an Omega, well, an Omega was the last word in a sentence that no one finished aloud, because the answer was always the same, and no one felt the need to say it out loud anymore. Tamvela was an Omega. She had known it since the morning she turned of age, and felt the bond of her rank settle into her like stones dropping into still water, heavy and without fuss, just a quiet and complete sinking. She was not angry about it, and she was not broken by it, because Tamvela had learned very early that anger cost energy, and she did not have energy to waste on things that the moon had already decided for her. She was slight in frame, with dark eyes that sat wide apart and caught the light in a way that made people uncomfortable if she held their gaze too long. So she had learned to look slightly to the side of people's faces when she spoke, and just enough to make them feel seen without feeling studied. Her hair was the deep red brown of old clay, and she kept it braided tight against her head, because loose hair was one more thing to manage, and Tamvela did not keep anything around her that had no purpose. She lived in the lower quarter of Ashkora, where the huts were smaller and the cooking fires burned lower, and where the smell of the tanning pits drifted in at night when the wind turned east. She mended things mostly, fur wraps and leather straps and the woven grass baskets that the elder women used to carry grain from the storehouse, because her hands were steady and her work was clean and she did not charge more than was fair. People brought her torn things and she fixed them, and they left, and they did not stay to talk, and that was the shape of her days. And she did not mind it, but the truth, the real and private truth that Tamvela kept folded tight inside her chest, was that she noticed everything. She noticed the way Brecker the Beta Guard shifted his weight to his left foot when he was about to raise his voice, and she noticed the way Elder Cornharder always touched the side of her own jaw when she was lying about the grain count, and she noticed the way the village dogs went silent in the east quarter, a full breath before strangers crested the hill road. She did not know why she noticed these things, and she did not know what to do with them, so she kept them folded away and kept mending torn things and kept her eyes to the side of people's faces and kept her mouth quiet. That was how she had always lived, and she had believed fully that it was how she would always live. Then the summons came, and the shape of her days broke apart like dry clay hit with a stone. The summons did not come to her directly, because things rarely came to an Omega directly in those days, and the truth was that it did not even come to her first. It came to the pack elder Cornharder, and Cornharder passed it down to the Beta Guard captain, and the Beta Guard captain passed it along to the workers' overseer, and finally, on the fourth day after the original summons had arrived, it reached Tamvela in the form of Wick, a young errand boy who looked deeply uninterested in the task he had been given. "You are wanted at the Great Hall of Kelvrath," Wick said, not quite looking at her, picking at the loose end of his lace belt. Tamvela set down the strap she was mending and looked at the side of his face and said, "More by whose word?" Wick shrugged one shoulder and said, "The king's own word, they say, but I don't know why they'd want someone from the lower quarter." And then he left, because he had said the thing he was sent to say, and the rest was not his concern. Tamvela sat very still for a long moment after he was gone. Kelvrath was not just a great hall. It was the seat of the Alpha King Draven, and Draven was not just a king. He was the kind of name that made veteran warriors press their backs to the wall when he entered a room, just to have stone behind them. He was said to be fierce in the way that old storms were fierce, not loud at the start, not rushing, just building and building until you realized too late that the sky above you had gone entirely wrong. He had ruled the ancient territory of Wolvenhar for 11 years. And in those 11 years, 3 assassination attempts had been made against him, and all 3 had ended with the assassins in pieces, and the pieces sent back to whoever had hired them, wrapped in the hiring party's own colours. He was not a king who asked for mercy, and he was not a king who gave it without cost, and Tamvela had no idea why his summons had found its way to the lower quarter of a mid-standing pack on the edge of his territory. But she folded her mending, and she banked her small fire, and she put on her second-best wrap, because her best one had a tear she had not yet fixed, and she set out on the road toward Kelvrath before the sun reached the top of the sky. The road was 3 days long, and she walked it mostly alone, sleeping in the low hollows where the road dipped close to streams, in eating from the small pouch of dried meal and smoked root she had packed, without thinking too hard about how much she would need. On the second morning, she passed a group of warriors heading the same direction, Large men with the thick necks and wide stances of trained fighters wearing the black and ash-grey colours of packs that served under Draven's banner. They did not speak to her, and she did not expect them to, but she watched them the way she watched everything, quietly and from the side. One of them had a blade on his hip that was tied with the wrong knot, loose at the inner loop, the kind of knot that looked secure at a glance but would let the blade shift in the sheath if he moved fast, and it bothered her the way a crooked stone in a wall bothered her, not dangerous to her, just wrong in a way that sat uneasily in her mind. The great hall of Kelvrath appeared on the third afternoon, rising from a flat-topped hill the way a fist rises from a forearm, sudden and sure, and impossible to miss. It was built from dark grey stone and old timber, and the walls were hung with the pelts of wolves that had challenged Draven and lost, not a cruelty exactly, more of a language that every wolf who came to that hill understood before they ever passed through the gate. The gate guards looked her over when she arrived, and she could see the question in their faces. Small Omega woman from the lower quarter, no weapons, no colours, no rank worth mentioning. She gave them her name and said she had been summoned, and one of them went inside. And she waited, standing still in the cooling air of the late afternoon while the wind carried smoke and the smell of roasted grain down from the hall above. The guard came back and his face had changed slightly, just around the eyes, the way a face changes when it has been given information it did not expect. "You are to be taken to the inner hall," he said, and his voice was careful in the way voices get when people are trying not to show confusion. She followed him inside through the outer yard where more warriors stood in groups talking low, through a second gate of heavy timber, and into the body of the hall itself, where the ceilings were high and the fire pits burned long and low down the centre of the room. There were people here of every rank, advisors in fine-stitched wraps, warriors in their colours, our elders with the bone markers of their offices hanging at their chests, and all of them turned to look at her as she was walked through the room. She kept her eyes to the side of their faces and kept her steps even and kept her breathing slow. At the far end of the hall, on a raised stone seat that was not quite a throne but was close enough that no one called it anything else, sat Draven. He was large the way mountains are large, not loud about it, just simply and entirely taking up the space around him in a way that made the space feel smaller even though the hall was vast. His hair was dark and unbound, and his jaw was set hard, and his eyes were on her before she had taken 3 steps into the room, and they did not move off her as she walked the length of the fire pits to stand before him. She stopped at the respectful distance and dipped her head once, not low enough to be submissive, but not so shallow as to be bold, and she looked at the side of his jaw and waited. The hall was very quiet. Draven looked at her for a long moment, and his face gave nothing, absolutely nothing. And then he said, in a voice that was quieter than she had expected from a man his size, "You are Tamvela of Ashkorra." She said, "I am." He said, "You mend things." She said, "I do." He was quiet again for another moment, and then he said, "I was told that you see things that others miss, and that you have never once been wrong about what you have seen." And his eyes had not moved off her face even once since she entered the room. Tamvela said nothing, because no one had ever said that to her before, and she was not sure how to answer a thing she had never been told about herself in those exact words. Draven leaned forward slightly in his seat and said, "Someone is going to try to kill me. And I believe they will try it soon, and I believe they will try it here, inside this hall, during the gathering feast that begins in 3 days. The fire pits burned low and steady between them, and the hall was very still. He said, "My guards are the finest I have ever trained. My advisors are sharp, my walls are tight, and in 11 years, no one has put a blade within reach of me inside these walls." And his voice was level, and even in a way that made every word land cleanly. He said, "And yet I am not easy." He looked at her for one more long moment and said, "I want you in that feast hall and I want your eyes open. And I want you to tell me what you see." Tamvela finally looked directly at him, just for a breath, just long enough to read the thing in his face that she had been reading slowly from the edge since she walked in, and what she read there was not fear, because Draven was not a man who feared in the ordinary way. What she read there was certainty, the cold and clear certainty of a man who knows that something is already in motion and cannot yet see where it will land. She looked back to the side of his jaw and said, "I will need to move freely through the hall and the grounds before the feast begins." And her voice was even, because that was simply what she would need, and there was no use dressing it up. Draven's eyes did not change, but something in his shoulders settled just barely, and he said, "It will be arranged." And that was how Tamvela, of the lower quarter of Ashkora, Omega, mender of torn things, woman that no one counted, came to stand inside the walls of Kelvrath 3 days before someone tried to end the life of the most feared Alpha King in all the ancient lands of Wolvenhar. She did not know yet that the assassin was already inside the walls. She did not know yet that he had been inside for 6 days. And she did not know yet that the thing sleeping inside her, the thing she had always folded away and kept quiet, was not just a habit of noticing, but something older and sharper and far more dangerous than anything she had ever let herself believe about herself. But she would know all of it before the feast fire burned down to ash. They gave Tamvela a small room near the back of the inner hall, close to the grain stores, and she understood without being told that this was the room they gave to people they did not know what to do with, people who had been invited by the king, but did not fit anywhere in the order of things that everyone else understood. The room had a straw mat, a clay water pot, and a single narrow window that looked out over the inner yard. And Tamvela set her pack down on the mat and stood at that window for a long time, looking out at the yard the way she had looked at 100 rooms before, reading it slowly, finding the low places and the hidden channels where things moved beneath the surface. The yard was busy with the preparation for the gathering feast. Wolves moved in every direction, carrying timber and clay pots and bundles of dried herb, all setting up the long stone tables that would run the length of the great hall, beating the old woven mats clean against the outer wall, hauling water from the deep well in the far corner. She watched all of it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, and slowly, the way a picture in still water becomes clear once you stop disturbing the surface, the shape of the yard settled into something she could read. She saw where the guards changed, and when. She saw which doorways were watched and which were not. She saw the pattern of the servants' movement, the paths they walked, the places they stopped, the moments when the yard went briefly thin and unobserved. And she saw something else. On the second morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, while she saw a man cross the inner yard from the direction of the wood store, moving toward the hall's side entrance with a bundle of cut timber over his shoulder. He was dressed as a wood carrier, rough cloth and worn leather, his face lowered under the weight of the load, and he moved with the unhurried ease of someone who had been doing this task for a long time. He looked like a wood carrier. He smelled like a wood carrier, and every guard in the yard looked straight past him, the way people look past things that fit perfectly into the world around them. Tamvela watched him from her narrow window, and something in her chest went very still and very cold, the way the air goes still and cold just before a storm breaks. It was the wood. The bundle on his shoulder was not cut from the same timber as the rest of the wood piled against the outer wall. The grain was finer, the colour slightly darker, and it had not been cut the way working wood was cut, rough and fast and practical. It had been cut neatly, almost carefully, as though the shape of it mattered for a reason that had nothing to do with burning. She watched him carry it through the side entrance, and she watched the door close behind him, and she stood at her window for a long time after, her hands very still at her sides. She did not go to the guards, not yet. She went to the hall itself, because she needed to see more before she said anything, and because Tamvela had learned that an Omega who raised an alarm and turned out to be wrong paid a price that was not fair and did not matter to the ones collecting it. She moved through the hall the way she moved through every space, quietly, purposefully, making herself look as though she had a task and knew exactly where she was going. The hall was full of workers still setting up for the feast, and no one looked at her twice because no one ever did. And for once in her life, she was grateful for that in a way that went deeper than habit. She found the side passage where the wood carrier had entered and followed it to the inner storeroom where the feastwood was stacked. And she stood in the doorway and let her eyes move slowly across the stacked timber. The bundle from that morning had been placed near the back, set against the wall behind the older wood, which meant it would be reached last, which meant someone had planned for it to be there at a specific time. Not now, but later, or when the feast fires were burning low and needed feeding and a servant would reach to the back of the stack without thinking about what they were pulling from it. She crossed the room and crouched beside the bundle and pressed her fingers along the grain of the wood and felt the hollow space inside it before she had even looked, because her fingers knew the difference between solid timber and something carved out and refilled, the way her eyes knew the difference between a real knot and a false one. She looked. The centre log had been hollowed and sealed again with pine resin, and inside the hollow, wrapped in dark cloth to keep it from rattling, was a small clay vessel no bigger than her closed fist, stoppered tight with wax. She did not open it. She knew what it was without opening it. Because the smell was there even through the wax and the cloth and the resin, faint and sweet in a way that had no business being sweet. The smell of ember root paste, the kind that had no taste and no colour and no smell strong enough to catch in a cup of dark wine. And that stopped a wolf's heart as quietly and completely as a hand pressed over a candle flame. Tambella sat back on her heels and breathed slowly and looked at the clay vessel in her hands and thought about everything it meant. The assassin was not coming from outside the walls. The assassin was already inside. He had been inside long enough to plant this, to learn the timing of the wood stores, to know which bundle would be reached for, at which moment during the feast. He was patient, and he was thorough, and he was very, very good. And he was planning to kill Draven, not with a blade in the open, but with poison in the feast fire. Smoke and ember root rising together into the hall, invisible in the cedar smoke, odourless to anyone who did not know exactly what they were smelling for, drifting over the head table where the king would sit and breathe deeply in the warmth of a feast fire all evening until his heart simply stopped. She wrapped the vessel back in its cloth and set it carefully in the exact position she had found it, because she did not want the assassin to know she had found it. Not yet. And she rose and walked back through the passage and through the hall, and back to her small room near the grain stores. and she sat on her straw mat and looked at her steady hands and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She could go to Draven now and tell him everything. He would believe her or he would not, and either way the assassin would know his plan had been discovered, and he would change it. And whatever his next plan was would be something she had not yet seen and had not yet found. And a threat you cannot see is worse than a threat you have already located. She thought about the wood carrier in the yard. She thought about the 6 days the assassin had already been inside these walls. She thought about how well he moved, how completely he fit into the space around him, how thoroughly he had prepared. And she thought about the feast, 3 days away, and the king who would sit at the head of the long stone table and breathe in cedar smoke, and never know that the thing killing him was the warmth of his own hall fire. She pressed her hands flat on her knees, and she breathed out slowly through her nose, and she made a decision that was not the safe decision, and was not the small decision, and was not the kind of decision that Omegas were supposed to make in the world of Wolvenhar. But she made it anyway, because it was the right one. And Tamvela had always known the difference between those two things even when no one gave her credit for it. She was going to find the assassin first. She was going to learn everything he had planned, and she was going to be ready, in the hall, at the feast, when he made his move. She would not warn the guards. She would not move the vessel. She would let the plan stay exactly where it was, and she would stay exactly where she needed to be, and when the moment came, she would not miss it. She had never been wrong about what she saw, and she was not wrong now, and the only question left was whether the thing sleeping inside her, that old and sharp and quiet thing, would be awake enough to do what the moment required of it when the time finally came. Outside her narrow window, the inner yard went on with its preparation, and the wood store sat quiet in the hall. And somewhere inside the walls of Kelvrath, the assassin moved through his day like a shadow, unhurried, certain, and completely unaware that a pair of wide-set dark eyes had already found him. The first full day Tamvela spent inside Kelvrath, she did not speak to anyone except to answer when she was spoken to, and no one spoke to her much, because she was an Omega, in a hall full of ranked wolves, and her presence was noted only in the way that a small piece of furniture is noted, as a thing that exists and takes up a small amount of space and presents no particular interest. This suited her completely. She moved through the hall and the yard and the passages and the outer buildings the way water moves through a stone channel, following the shape of the space, going where the space allowed, making no sound and leaving no mark. She was learning the hall the way she had always learned things, slowly and completely, building the picture from the edges inward until she could close her eyes and walk any path inside those walls without error. She found 3 more things the assassin had placed. A strip of dried cloth soaked in ember root oil, tucked behind the bracket of the torch nearest the king's seat, thin enough that the heat of the torch would eventually dry it to nothing and release the oil into the air above the table in a slow and invisible drift. A small bone carving wedged into the gap between 2 stones in the wall behind the high seat, which she did not touch because she could not tell yet what it was for, and did not want to disturb it before she understood its purpose. And a second clay vessel, smaller than the first, set into the hollow of a split timber in the wall of the outer passage that led from the kitchen to the feast hall. You stop at the same way and smelling the same way and placed so that anyone brushing past it in the narrow passage would not notice they had cracked the wax seal and released what was inside into the air of the passage. The assassin was not relying on one plan. He had layered them, one inside the other, the way a careful hunter layers traps along a game trail, so that if the animal avoids the first, it meets the second, and if it avoids the second, it meets the third. He was thorough in a way that made Tamvella's chest tighten. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular kind of tension that comes from recognizing something very skilled and very dangerous, and knowing that you are the only thing standing between it and the thing it is aimed at. She watched the wood carrier again on the second morning. Oh, and this time she was positioned better, standing near the grain store entrance with a basket she had borrowed from a kitchen worker, looking like exactly what she appeared to be. An Omega doing a small task in the vicinity of a busy yard. He crossed the yard again at the same hour, carrying an empty sack this time, heading toward the outer building where the dry goods were stored. She watched his face as he passed within a few body lengths of her, and she kept her own face completely empty and her eyes aimed just past him, and she read him in the time it took him to cross her line of sight. His name in the hall was Derek, given as a worker from the eastern supply villages who had been brought in for the feast preparation along with a dozen others. He was of middle height and middle build, with a plain face that was designed, as she understood now, to be forgotten the moment you stopped looking at it. His eyes were pale and set close, and they moved in a way that ordinary workers' eyes did not move, not over the surfaces of things, not following the natural pull of activity and sound, but in a slow and deliberate pattern that covered the yard in sections, the way a guard covers a perimeter methodically, without lingering. He did not look at people. He looked at positions. He looked at angles. He was reading the yard the same way she read it, and the understanding of that settled into her chest, like a cold stone finding the bottom of a deep well. He was good. He was very good. And he was. She was certain of it now, the one who had placed everything she had found, and probably other things she had not found yet. And he had been doing all of it in plain sight of guards and workers and baiters, and not one of them had seen anything but a plain-faced supply worker doing an ordinary task. On the second afternoon, she went to Draven. She asked to speak to him privately, and the advisor who received the request looked at her with a very particular kind of expression, the kind that says the thing it means without saying it aloud, which was that Omega women from lower quarter packs did not typically request private audiences with the Alpha King. But she had been summoned by Draven himself, and whatever reason he had for summoning her had been enough to bring her to Kelvrath. So the advisor went inside and came back with a different expression and led her to a smaller inner room where Draven was sitting alone with a clay cup and a skin of dark water, and the look of a man who had not slept well in several days. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes were sharp even through the tiredness in them, and she crossed the room and stood before him and said, clearly and without decoration, "The plan to kill you is already inside these walls. It has been inside for at least 6 days, and the man running it is registered in your hall under the name Derek of the Eastern Supply Villages." Draven was very still. She continued, and she told him about the hollow log and the ember root vessel and the torch bracket and the passage and the bone carving she had not yet identified. One, she described the wood carrier in the yard, his height and build and pale, close-set eyes, and the way they moved in sections across the perimeter. And she described the layering of the plan, the way it was designed to catch him even if one part failed, and she told him all of it in the same even voice she used to tell people the cost of mending a fur wrap. Draven did not speak until she was finished. Then he was quiet for a moment more, and then he said, "How certain are you?" She said, "Completely." He looked at her for a long time, and she let him look, because she understood that he was not doubting her, He was measuring the shape of what she had just given him and finding the edges of it. Then he said, "What do you need?" And the fact that he said that, and not any of the other things he could have said, had told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was underneath the feared name and the stone seat. She said, "I need you to do nothing different. Nothing in the hall changes, no guard moves, no arrangement shifts. No one in your court knows what I have told you except you." He raised one dark eyebrow just slightly. She said, "If the assassin sees any change, he adjusts, and the next plan he makes will be one I have not found yet." Draven looked at his clay cup and then back at her and said, "You want to let him run his plan so that you can meet it?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And what happens at the feast when the moment comes?" She said, "I will be there." And she held his gaze directly for the first time, not to the side of his jaw, but straight into those tired amber eyes. And she said, "Trust me." The room was quiet for a long moment after that. Then Draven nodded once, a slow and deliberate movement, and said nothing more. And Tamvela understood that the conversation was finished, and that she had been given what she asked for. And she dipped her head once and left the room and walked back through the hall toward her small room near the grain stores. Her hands were steady. Her mind was very clear. The feast was one day away, and somewhere in the hall, Derwick of the Eastern Supply Villages was finishing his preparations, certain that he had not been seen, certain that tonight he would do what he had come to do and walk out of Kelvrath through a door that no one was watching. He had been certain of that same thing in every hall he had ever entered, and he had always been right. But he had never been in a hall that contained Tamvela of Ashkorra. And he did not know she existed, and that, more than anything she had found in the walls and the wood store and the torch bracket, was the only advantage she needed. The gathering feast began at sundown, when the fire pits were lit and the torches were set burning in every bracket along the walls, and the long stone tables were filled with wolves from every pack that owed allegiance to Draven, alphas and betas, and their attendants, all of them dressed in their finest colours and carrying the particular energy of wolves who had travelled far to be seen in a powerful place. The great hall of Kelvrath was alive in a way that it was not alive on ordinary nights. Every corner bright with firelight, and every surface warm with the heat of too many bodies in a large space, and the smell of roasted meat and dark berry wine and cedar smoke rolled through the room in waves that made the air feel thick and good, and full of the kind of certainty that comes from being surrounded by strength. It was exactly the kind of night the hall had been built for, vast and blazing and full of itself, the kind of night that made every wolf inside those walls feel like the world was exactly as it was supposed to be, and that nothing wrong could enter a place this bright, and this loud, and this sure. Tamvela had been in position since before the first guest arrived. She stood near the entrance of the side passage that connected the feast hall to the wood store and the kitchen corridor, holding a water jug that gave her a reason to move slowly and freely through the room without drawing attention to herself, which was not difficult because she had been drawing no attention to herself her entire life, and she was very good at it. She had dressed the same as always, plain cloth and tight braided hair, and she had kept the short working knife pressed flat against her ribs under her wrap since early morning, and she had spent the hours before the feast confirming everything she already knew. The hollow log was still in the wood store, sitting in its place against the back wall exactly where she had found it. The cloth strip soaked in ember root oil was still behind the torch bracket nearest the king's seat. The small vessel in the wall of the kitchen passage was still in the split timber where Derek had placed it. Everything was exactly where it had been, and everything was waiting for the moment its maker had chosen for it. And Tamvela was waiting too, in her own way, with her water jug and her plain face, and her wide dark eyes moving slowly across the room in those long and careful sweeps. She found Derek within the first 10 minutes of the feast. He was standing along the far wall in the section of the hall where the lower-ranked attendants gathered, the ones who had come as company for higher-ranked wolves and had no official role in the ceremony of the evening. And he looked exactly as he always looked, plain and forgettable and utterly relaxed in the way that only truly dangerous things are relaxed, the way a trap is relaxed when it is set and waiting. He was watching the room in those slow, deliberate sections that she recognized by now, covering the hall the way a hunter covers a piece of ground, not rushing, not lingering, reading angles and distances and positions with eyes that looked casual to anyone who did not know what casual eyes looked like versus eyes that were working. She watched him for a few moments and then moved her own gaze away from him because she did not want him to feel watched. And Tamvela understood, as few people did, that the watched sometimes feel the watching even when they cannot see where it comes from. The feast moved through its first hours the way great feasts always did, food and drink, and the warm rising noise of many wolves talking at once, the particular music of a hall full of people who are well fed and well warmed and feel safe and important. Draven sat at the head of the central table looking exactly as he always looked in that seat, broad and still and faintly remote, his amber eyes making their slow rounds of the room, and he did not look at Tamvela, not once because they had agreed he would not. Because a king's eyes on an omega across a feast hall was the kind of small strange thing that a careful man like Derwick would notice and file away and factor into whatever he was planning. Everything in the hall had to feel exactly like a normal feast, and so it did, because Draven was very good at being exactly what the room expected him to be. As the night deepened, the fire pits began to burn lower, the way feast fires always did when the celebrating went on past the middle hours and the first load of timber had given its heat and gone to ash. The serving wolves began their trips to the wood store, crossing the hall with carry harnesses and returning with loads of timber from the front of the stack, the older wood, the safe wood, and feeding it into the pits. And the fires rose again and the warmth rolled back across the tables, and the guests barely noticed the brief cooling. They were too deep in their cups and their conversations for the small fluctuations of a feast fire to reach them. Tamvela watched every trip, tracking which part of the stack each load came from, keeping her count, knowing exactly how many trips it would take before the servant's arm reached deep enough to find the back of the stack and the hollow log that was waiting there. She watched Derek between each trip. He had not moved from the far wall yet, but she could see the quality of his stillness changing in the way that water changes quality when it is about to move, something gathering underneath the surface, a slow and invisible tightening. His eyes were still moving in their sections across the room, but the sections were getting smaller, concentrating, narrowing down from the whole hall to a particular part of the hall, the part that contained the head of the central table and the back of the Alpha King's neck. Tamvela took one slow breath and moved her position slightly, drifting toward the near end of the central table, keeping her water jug up and her face empty and her eyes on the angle between Derek and the king, measuring it the way a river measures the drop ahead of it, continuously and without rest. The third trip to the wood store happened, and the servant came back with a load from deeper in the stack, still not the hollow log, but one layer closer to it, and Tamvela felt the fine hairs on her arms rise under her sleeve and stay risen. She looked at Derek, and he had moved, not much. Not in a way that anyone tracking ordinary movement would mark as significant, just a drift of perhaps 4 body lengths along the far wall. But the drift had brought him closer to the central table and placed him at an angle to the torch bracket near the king's seat, and his right hand was hanging at his side in a position that looked completely natural, except that the fingers were gathered slightly, not loosely hanging the way resting fingers hang, but drawn together just enough, just that small and telling amount that said the hand was thinking about closing around something. And that was when Tamvela understood the thing she had not fully understood before, the thing that rearranged the entire picture in her mind like a stone dropped into a settled pattern, scattering it and letting it fall into its true shape. The poison in the wood was not the killing blow. The poison in the wood was the noise, the distraction, the thing that would pull every guard in the hall toward the fire pits and create the shift and the chaos and the movement that would give Derek his angle on the king's back. The ember root in the hollow log would not kill Draven. It would create the moment in which Derek would kill Draven, with his hands close and fast and silent, in a hall full of wolves who were all looking the wrong way at exactly the right time. She had found the tools and understood the poison and mapped the placement, and she had been right about all of it, and she had still not seen the whole of it until this moment, standing in the middle of the feast with her water jug and 3 breaths left before Derek stopped drifting and started moving. She set the water jug down on the nearest table without breaking her stride, pressing it to the stone surface with one hand and releasing it cleanly, and she moved through the hall the way she had always moved through every space, smoothly and with purpose and completely without urgency, because urgency draws eyes, and she could not afford eyes on her now. She kept her face empty and her breathing controlled, and she let her hand find the blade under her wrap the way her hand always found things she had placed carefully, without looking, without fumbling, her fingers closing around the plain bone handle with the quiet sureness of someone who has thought through this moment many times and let the thinking settle into the body where it becomes something other than thought. She came at him from the left and slightly wide, not straight from behind where he might feel her coming through the change in the air at his back, but from the side and angling in, closing the last distance in 2 fast and certain steps, and she drove the blade into the space below his right shoulder with the full and focused strength of someone who had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this moment and had no hesitation left in her and no room for any. Derwick made a sound, short and airless, something that was swallowed almost entirely by the noise of the feast around them, and he went rigid from the shock of it and then began to drop. And Tamvela went down with him with her hand still firm on the blade, controlling the fall so that it did not crash into the table edge or knock a cup to the stone floor, or make any sound louder than the warm chaos of a feast in full voice. She brought him to the floor and held him there, her knees on the cold stone, her hand steady on the blade, her face completely clear, and she looked at his pale, close-set eyes, and he looked at hers, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say and the time for saying things was not this moment. She watched his eyes go from sharp to clouded to distant, and she held her position, and the feast went on around them for 3 full breaths, before anyone at the nearest table happened to look down at the floor and see what was there. Then the sound went through the hall the way sounds like that always go, fast and in every direction at once, and the feast broke apart into standing wolves and drawn blades and the hard voices of guards pushing through the crowd. And Tamvela stayed exactly where she was, on the cold stone floor of the great hall of Kelvrath, with the water jug sitting on the table above her and the blade in her steady hand, and the assassin who had never once been seen lying on the floor before her, seen at last, stopped at last, by the one wolf in all of Wolvenhar that no one had ever thought to count. What happened in those 3 breaths was this. Tamvela held the blade steady and kept Derek on the floor and kept her face completely clear. And she looked at him the way she looked at everything, from a place of complete and focused stillness, and she watched the light in his pale eyes go from sharp to clouded to something else entirely. He did not fight her. She had placed the blade well, she had known she would, and whatever strength he still had was going fast, and he seemed to understand this the way very skilled people understand the end of a thing without fighting the understanding. He looked at her face, and she looked at his, and for a moment they were simply 2 wolves on a stone floor in the middle of a feast that did not yet know they were there. Then someone at the nearest table looked down, and the sound that came out of that someone was the kind of sound that spreads through a room like fire, through dry grass, fast and in all directions at once. And within moments the great hall of Kelvrath was no longer a feast, it was a chaos of standing wolves and overturned cups, and the sharp ring of blades being drawn from sheaths all around the room. The guards were moving before most of the guests had finished standing, pushing through the crowd toward the place on the floor where Tamvela knelt beside a dying man with a plain-handled working knife in her steady hand. They reached her fast, and they were not gentle about it, because guards in a crisis are not in the habit of being gentle about things they do not yet understand. And what they saw was an Omega woman they did not recognize crouched over a bleeding man on the floor of the king's feast hall. And that was not a picture that invited careful handling. They pulled her to her feet and pulled the blade from her hand and held her between 2 large bodies. And she let them, because she had expected this. And it did not frighten her, and it did not change anything that mattered. Draven was standing at the head of the central table. He had risen when the sound went through the room, and now he stood looking at the floor where Derek lay, and his face was the same unreadable stone it always was, but his eyes were moving, reading the room in those slow amber sweeps, taking in the positions of his guards and the placement of his guests, and the body on the floor and the woman held between his 2 largest warriors. And he was very still in the way that powerful things go very still when they are processing something important. One of the senior guards, a wide-shouldered beta named Wolvenhar, who had been with Draven for 9 of his 11 years of rule, crouched beside Derek and checked the wound and then checked the man's face and then checked inside his clothing, and what he found there made him go very still for a moment before he rose and turned to Draven and said, "My king, this man carries 3 more blades and a sealed vessel of ember root paste, and he is not on any supply roster I have ever signed." The hall was very quiet by then, the kind of quiet that comes after chaos, when everyone is still standing and still breathing fast, but the noise has gone out of the room like air from a punctured bladder. Wolvenhar looked at Tamvela, and then back at Draven and said, "She stopped him." And his voice carried the particular flatness of a man saying a thing that he did not entirely have words for yet. Draven walked the length of the hall. He did not hurry and he did not slow. He simply walked it the way he walked every space, as though the space belonged to him and had always belonged to him, and the crowd parted ahead of him and stayed parted behind him, and everyone watched him come. He stopped in front of Tamvela, and the two guards holding her looked at him, and he looked back at them with those amber eyes, and they released her arms and stepped aside, and then it was just Draven and Tamvela in the middle of the great hall of Kelvrath, with every ranked wolf in Wolvenhar watching them from every direction. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked at the side of his jaw, and the hall was so quiet that the sound of the fire pits was clear and steady in the air between them. Then Draven said, "You knew he was here before you told me." "It was not a question," she said. "Yes," he said. "You knew what he planned and when he planned to do it." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you said nothing to my guards and moved nothing in the hall and let it run until tonight." She said, "Yes." He was quiet again, and then he said, "Why?" And his voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something she had not heard in it before, something that was not anger and was not relief exactly, but was somewhere between those two things. She said, "Because a plan that is known to many becomes a plan that leaks, and a plan that leaks becomes a different plan. And the different plan is always the one you have not found." She paused and said, "And because I needed him to run what he had prepared, so that I could be where I needed to be when he ran it." Draven looked at her for another long moment and said nothing. Then he looked down at Derek on the floor and back at her, and he said quietly, so that only she and the nearest wolves could hear it clearly, "You saved my life, Tamvela of Ashkorra." She said nothing, because it was true and she did not feel the need to dress it up or push it away. He said, "And you did it alone, and you did it without rank, and you did it in a way that not one of my trained warriors managed to do in 6 days." His voice was still level, but the thing underneath it had come slightly closer to the surface, and she could read it now clearly. And what it was something very close to wonder. The hall was still watching. Every alpha and beta and ranked wolf in that room was watching an Omega woman stand in front of the most feared king in Wolvenhar and hear him say those words, and the silence in the room was not the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of something shifting, the way the ground shifts when something very heavy moves underground, slow and deep, and impossible to stop once it has started. Tamvela looked directly at Draven and said, "I mend torn things. That is what I do." And something moved in his face then, just briefly, just at the edges. The thing that she had learned in 5 days of reading him was the closest he ever came to something warm, and he said, "Yes, you do." And the hall breathed again all at once, like something had been held and then released. They kept Derek alive through the night, because a dead assassin answers no questions, and Draven wanted answers. Forthak and 2 of the senior guards took him to the lower room beneath the hall, and they worked through the dark hours, and by the time the first grey light of morning was coming through the high vents in the ceiling, they had the shape of it. Derrick's real name was not Derek. It had not been Derek in a very long time, and before that name it had been other names, in other halls, in other territories, and every one of those names had belonged to a man that people remembered as plain-faced and ordinary and completely unremarkable right up until something terrible happened. He had been working his trade for 3 generations of hiring, passing from one lord's gold to another's. And the list of names that Forthak brought to Draven in the early morning was a list that made the king read it twice, and then set it face down on the stone table and sit very still for a long moment. Tamvela was not in the room when Fortak brought the list. She was in her small room near the grain stores, sitting on her straw mat with her steady hands in her lap, and she was thinking about going home. The task she had been brought to Kelvrath to do was finished, and she was an Omega from a lower quarter pack, and the world did not change its shape overnight just because an Omega had done a remarkable thing inside its walls, and she understood this the way she understood most things, clearly, and without flinching. She had done what she came to do, and now she would go back to Ashkora, and she would mend torn things. And the story would be told without her in it, the way most stories were told about Omegas, around the outside of what they had done rather than through the centre of it. She was thinking this when the knock came at her door. It was not Fortak, and it was not one of the senior guards, and it was not the advisor with the careful expression. It was Draven. He stood in the doorway of her small room near the grain stores, in the plain morning light, without any of the trappings of rank that he wore in the hall, just a large and tired man with dark, unbound hair and amber eyes that were still sharp even through the long night they had kept. He looked at the small room and at the straw mat and at the plain cloth of her wrap and at her steady hands in her lap, and he said, "May I come in?" And his voice was quiet the way it had been quiet in the inner room 3 days ago, without the weight of the hall behind it. She said, "Yes," and he came in and sat on the grain sack against the wall, because the room had no second seat, and she looked at the side of his jaw and waited. He said, "The man who hired Derwick is one of my own inner council." He said it simply, without decoration, the way she had told him about the hollow log and the torch bracket 3 days ago, just the shape of the thing, clean and complete. She said, "I know." He looked at her and said, "How long have you known?" She said, "Since the second day, when I saw the bone carving in the wall behind your seat." And she told him what the carving was. A signal marker. A small sign cut in a code she had learned as a child from an old wolf in Ashkora, who had once served a great warlord in the Eastern Territories, and had passed the time of his retirement teaching a quiet Omega girl the things he had learned about how shadows communicated with the people who hired them. Draven listened, and he said nothing until she was finished, and then he said, "You knew there was someone inside my council, and you still said nothing until you were ready." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer either way changes nothing about what you have already done here, and what you have already done here will not be forgotten." She waited. He said, "Stay in Kelvrath. Not as a servant, and not as an attendant, and not in a room near the grain stores." He said, "I have an inner council with a seat on it that is going to be empty before this day is finished, and I have a hall full of ranked wolves who are very skilled at the things that ranked wolves are skilled at, and I have a threat in every direction that comes not from strength, but from the quiet and patient work of people I cannot see until it is almost too late." He looked at her steadily and said, "I need someone who sees what others miss, and who is never wrong about what they see, and who makes decisions based on what is true rather than what is ranked." He said, "I need you, Tambella." The morning light was pale and clean through the narrow window. Tamvela looked at her hands for a moment, or those steady hands that had mended torn things in a lower quarter hut for as long as she could remember. And she thought about Ashkora and the tanning smell when the wind turned east, and the straw mat she slept on, and the errand boy who had not looked at her when he delivered the summons that changed everything. She thought about the thing that had been sleeping inside her, that old and sharp and quiet thing, and she thought about how it had felt to finally let it wake, how it had felt to move through those walls with a purpose that matched what she was rather than apologizing for it, how it had felt to stand on that stone floor in the middle of the great feast hall and look directly at the most feared king in Wolvenhar and hear him say that she had saved his life. She thought about all of it. And then she looked at the side of Draven's jaw, and then she looked directly into his amber eyes, and she said, "I will need a proper seat at the council table." Something moved in his face again, that warm thing at the edges, and he said, "You will have it." She said, "And I will need to move freely through every part of these walls at every hour, without question and without escort." He said, "Agreed," she said, "and I will not be ranked, because rank is not what I am, and pretending otherwise would make me less useful to you, not more." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Agreed," and his voice was careful and honest, in the way that voices are when they are saying something that costs them a comfortable assumption. She nodded once, and he nodded once, and that was the agreement. He made in a small room near the grain stores in the plain morning light, with no ceremony and no witnesses, and no one to mark it down in the old records, because it was not the kind of thing the old records had a page for. An Omega given a seat at the Alpha King's inner council, not as a servant, and not as a decoration, and not as a thing that someone had decided to be generous about, but as the most necessary wolf in the hall, because she was the only one who had seen the assassin, and she had seen him before he could finish what he came to do, and she had ended him on the floor of the great hall in front of every ranked wolf in Wolvenhar, without flinching and without failing. They would tell this story for a long time after. They would tell it around fires in every pack that owed allegiance to Draven, and then in packs that did not, and then in territories so far from Kelvrath that the name of the place had never been heard before, and the name of Draven had only arrived as a rumour carried on the back of a trader's tale. They would tell it the way the oldest and truest stories are told, not as a lesson and not as a warning exactly, but as a thing that happened and mattered and refused to be made smaller by the telling. They would say that the most feared Alpha King in the ancient lands of Wolvenhar had been saved not by his warriors and not by his walls and not by any of the strong and ranked wolves who had spent their lives training to be the thing that stood between him and whatever came for him in the dark. They would say he had been saved by an Omega from the lower quarter, a woman with plain cloth and braided hair and wide dark eyes and hands that were always steady, who had seen what no one else could see and done what no one else had done and sat afterward at a stone table in the inner council of the great hall of Kelvrath, reading the room in that slow and particular way she had always read every room, from the edges inward, finding the low places and the hidden channels and the things that moved beneath the surface before they could rise up and do their damage. Tamvela of Ashkorra, the Omega who saw the assassin, the wolf who saved a king, the one that no one had counted, until the night it cost everything not to. She never went back to Ashkora, but she never forgot the smell of the tanning pits when the wind turned east. And she never forgot what it had felt like to be the last word in a sentence that no one finished, because remembering it kept her sharp, and sharp was what she had always been, and sharp was what she would always be. For every year she sat at that council table and read the world the way only she knew how to read it. The moon kept turning, the fires kept burning, and Kelvrath was never threatened from the inside again.